Chapter 1921. Auntie Zhao glared at her and snorted coldly. Linda laughed and hugged her arm. Her voice was extremely soft. I know you love me the most, don't you? Okay, hurry up and cook. Auntie Zhao stared at her for a long time and thought. She clearly did it on purpose. Otherwise, why would she suddenly become so clingy? She wasn't like this before. Although she thought so, Auntie Zhao didn't say it out loud. If she didn't say it out loud, the little girl would be embarrassed. Auntie Zhao went to the kitchen happily. She was very optimistic about this couple. Women usually said no, but they were very honest in their hearts. Linda stood in the living room, holding the child. Her eyes were a little blurred as she looked at the door. It wasn't that her heart didn't waver, but when she thought of the gossip after his marriage, her heart turned cold again. Old and lecherous. He deserved the divorce. She played with the child. Although her heart was firm, she still felt a little uneasy. After all, Du Yuesheng was outside, but now he should have left. Linda was uncertain, but at the same time, she was a little curious. So she looked at Annie Zhao with a delicate face and voice. Annie Zhao, go open the door and see if Du Yuesheng has left. Annie Zhao was cooking in full swing, and her voice was also loud. I'm cooking. I can't hear you, Linda said again, and Annie Zhao's voice was even louder. The wind is too strong. I can't hear you. Linda was speechless. She looked at the doorknob, then walked over, hesitated for a moment, and opened the door. In the end, as soon as she opened the door, her eyes met Du Yuesheng's face. Separated by a security door, Du Yuesheng's eyes were burning. Shan, I want to see the child. Let me hold him, okay? Linda instinctively took a step back and wanted to close the door. His voice sounded, if there's a lawsuit, I believe this child will be mine. After saying that, he paused and stared at her. Linda came back to her senses after a while, and her voice was a little exasperated. Du Yuesheng, you bastard. Du Yuesheng smiled slightly. If begging can't change your heart, then I don't mind being a bastard. Linda glared at him. One was inside, and the other was outside. After a long time, he opened his mouth and said in a slightly domineering manner, Open the door, or I will kick it open. She gasped. After a while, she abruptly opened the door. Du Yuesheng, what exactly do you want? There was no longer any barrier between them, and he looked at her gently. He took out a ring from his pocket. Shan, I only wanted to give you this. I'm late by a year. As he spoke, he himself was somewhat moved. At that time, he was very afraid on the night of his wedding to Lin Shimin. He knew that she would cry and be sad, so he divorced her as fast as he could. He had used some tricks during the divorce process, but he didn't want her to know. But he was very distressed. She didn't know and probably wouldn't accept him. Linda watched for a while before saying softly, Du Yuesheng, it's too late. She paused and looked a little sad. Even if you took this out and gave it to me before you got married, I would still believe it. Chapter 1922. Linda said a series of words. There were tears in her eyes, and she felt terrible. What was he doing now? Was it useful to look for her now? He had gone through everything to return her side. However, they did not have a past, not even the slightest bit of affection. At most, they slept together for one night. At most, they talked about what to do with the child. At most, he said that he would give her money and let her be a mistress outside. How could these be considered feelings? These were the most despicable and shameless things. How could she still have expectations for him? Linda's eyes were a little hot. She glared at him with a bit of hatred. That little gaze made Du Yuesheng's heart break. She hated him. Yes, she should hate him. He did not explain. He would rather be the bad guy, because only the bad guy could control her, and she would compromise. If she found out that there was so much sincerity hidden in his heart, she would be fearless and ignore him. His expression changed slightly, and when he walked in, he did not try to curry favor with Linda. Linda felt a little upset. She turned to the side and let him in. Seeing Du Yuesheng holding his daughter with a gentle face, Linda could not help but say, Du Yuesheng, you can come to see me once a year. She felt that she was being very generous, but Du Yuesheng looked up at her and snorted, Once a year? That meant that he would only have sex once a year? A man like Du Yuesheng had kept his chastity for her for more than a year, and he had long been holding back his anger. Tonight, he was going to have her. He looked at her indifferently, and the meaning in his eyes was unclear. Linda's body trembled, and she suddenly felt a little afraid. Regret? Du Yueshing reached out and pinched her chin. Regret letting me in, right? Linda pursed her lips and whispered, No. You're so humble now. Are you afraid that I'll steal the child? His voice was still cold. Linda shook her head. No. She was completely confused when it came to the child, and she could only look at him. Because she knew his power, and because Lanhua was his child, even Sister Liangqiu couldn't help her. She had no choice but to lower her head. Du Yuesheng didn't say anything else. The little bun in her arms didn't understand anything, but Annie Zhao was still busy in the kitchen, so it wasn't convenient for her to speak. He pursed his lips, kissed the child again, and handed the child to her. I'll go help in the kitchen. Linda was a little surprised. What could he do in the kitchen? Du Yuesheng took off her coat and threw it on the sofa. She rolled up her sleeves and calmly walked into the kitchen. She skillfully helped Annie Zhao cut the vegetables. In the end, the dishes were stir-fried by Du Yuesheng. It looked, smelled, and tasted great. Annie Zhao and Linda were so shocked that their eyes popped out. He was born into a rich family. How could he cook so well? Du Yuesheng cleverly did not say that he had deliberately learned it to make his ex-wife happy back then. However, after a few days, his ex-wife ran away with someone else at this moment. He looked at Linda and asked indifferently, Is it delicious? Auntie Zhao also looked at Linda, and there was a hint of amusement in her eyes. Linda lowered her head and snorted. Actually, it was really delicious. An imperceptible smile appeared in Du Yuesheng's eyes. She pursed her lips and did not say a word. Chapter 1923. Auntie Zhao looked around and suddenly said slowly, Shan, something happened in my hometown. I might have to go back for a month. Do you want to hire a new nurse? Linda bit her chopsticks and was a little surprised. What happened? You have to go back to your hometown. Annie Zhao's face showed a hint of shyness. Someone from my hometown introduced me to a man I like. I'm getting engaged when I go back. He will also come to be city later. Linda was stunned. Annie Zhao was already in her 50s. Was she looking for a second time? However, when Annie Zhao mentioned that man, her expression was the same as a young girl's. She must have liked that man very much. Linda smiled. Congratulations. If you get married one day, be sure to tell me. Auntie Zhao nodded. Of course. She then looked at Du Yuesheng and deliberately emphasized, Mr. Du, you can't bully Shan when I'm not here. Du Yuesheng smiled. Of course not. Linda felt that something was wrong when she heard that. She looked at Annie Zhao suspiciously. Annie Zhao was a smart person and immediately put on an expression that said, You actually suspect me. Linda's head immediately shrank back. She must have thought too much. Annie Zhao had indeed found her true love and went back to her hometown to get engaged. She ate gloomily and thought about how she would take care of the child for the next month. Or should she go to Sister Liangqiu's house for a month? It would also stop old Du's shameless pestering. Linda thought about it and made up her mind. She looked at old Du and snorted. He was shameless. Annie Zhao was very fast. After eating, she packed up her things and was about to leave. She had even bought the tickets. Linda's little mouth was wide open. This was too fast. It was hard not to suspect it. Du Yuesheng was very friendly and took the initiative to send Annie Zhao to the station. Auntie Zhao did not refuse. Linda watched them leave and thought for a moment while biting her fingers. She immediately ran to the bedroom to pack her things. She didn't have many things, but Lanhua had a lot of things. It was difficult for her to carry 2 big bags of things alone, not to mention taking care of a child. Therefore, she first put the things in the trunk of the car and went back to pick up her daughter. But when she returned and opened the door, she saw Du Yuesheng sitting on the sofa. Little Lanhua was lying on the sofa, and he was lovingly teasing the baby. Linda's blood froze. How did you get in? Oh, Auntie Zhao's key. Du Yuesheng raised it. Auntie Zhao was worried about you, so she asked me to take care of you. Linda closed the door slowly and said nothing. But you look like you're going out? Du Yuesheng's voice was unhurried. Why? Are you trying to escape me? No. She bit her lip and leaned her back against the door. Dui Wesheng, you're overthinking it. Is that so? He chuckled. If not, then bring your things and follow me to Hong Kong. I'm not going. Her emotional reaction was very strong. Dui Wesheng laughed, even more unbridled. Then we'll stay here, a family of 3. Who's with your family of 3? She said hatefully. Dui Wesheng, let me tell you, now that you're in B City, I can kill you like killing a chicken. Don't go too far, or I'll make sure you won't be able to return. Just as she finished speaking, she was hugged. Chapter 1924. Linda was dumbfounded as she stared at the shameless man in front of her. Dumbfounded? Ecstatic? Dui Wesheng continued to speak shamelessly, and then his large palm unceremoniously took advantage of her. Linda was embarrassed and angry. She struggled hard, but to no avail. Instead, as she struggled, their bodies became closer and closer to each other. She really had no choice but to lower her head and fiercely bite his neck. She mumbled, You bastard, let go of me. Bastard, of course I won't let go of what I got. Dui Wesheng lowered his head and looked at the little girl in his arms. It had been almost a year since they last saw each other. After giving birth, her skin had become a lot more tender. In the past, she was skinny and didn't have much meat, but now she was clearly a lot more plump. Dui Wesheng hugged her like that, and his breathing became a little heavy. He rubbed and kissed her, wanting to die. Looking at little Long Yue, who was sleeping soundly, Dui Wesheng, after an internal struggle, carried the woman in his arms and asked while kissing her, Where's your room? How could Linda be willing? She punched, kicked, bit, and scolded him, but none of this could stop the man whose brain was filled with sperm. Not saying? Then let's do it in Annie Zhao's room. Who knows, there might be a different kind of fun. He bullied her too much. Linda bit his shoulder tightly and suddenly let go. Her long hair was messily scattered on her face, and her forehead was covered with fine sweat from the struggle. She growled at him. Dui Wesheng, have you become a pervert? Dui Wesheng laughed softly. You can say that after we're done. He had already kicked open a room door and carried her in. What was worse was that the door was not closed. She was thrown onto the soft big bed and even bounced a few times. Her long black hair covered the pillow. Just when she wanted to get up, Dui Wesheng had already bent one leg to press her down. Raising his hand, he began to unbutton his shirt. Linda was stunned. Was he for real? In fact, they had only done it once, and it happened after she took that medicine. It was such a long time ago, she hid her body and said softly, Mr. Du, calm down. Actually, we really aren't that close. Linda said and swallowed hard. My dear mother, isn't he already in his early 40s? How could those 6 rows of abs be so attractive? It exuded a chocolatey luster. In such a situation, Linda could still remember. He looked thin with clothes on, but he looked fat without. Dui Wesheng looked at her little eyes and smiled slightly. Shan, you were pregnant with my child before. You said that you're not familiar with me. Huh? He bent over her lips and said, almost against hers, we don't know each other well. How did my seed get into your belly, huh? His words were vulgar, and his actions were even more vulgar. He was obviously a man of noble birth, but at this moment, he was no different from an ordinary man. He looked as if he hadn't eaten meat for 10 years and hadn't touched a woman for 10 years. His whole body was steaming and his eyes were bloodshot. Linda started to get scared. She shrank back, but how could a man who hadn't touched a woman for more than a year let her go so easily? Her lips were gagged, and her palms were pressed to the side of her body. It was as if she was nailed to a cross, allowing him to enjoy her. She was so ashamed that her resistance and curses were useless. The old man panted and ate her until not even her bones were left. Chapter 1925. She turned her face away unwillingly, a glint of tears in the corner of her eyes. Dui Wesheng's body finally cooled down a little. He had originally wanted to kiss her, but he reached out and gently pinched her little face instead. His voice was a little hoarse as he said, What's wrong? Linda turned her face away angrily and ignored him. Even at this moment, he was still dominating her, unwilling to let go. Seeing her awkward look, he didn't get angry. Instead, he laughed. Did I hurt you? Linda glared at him. No, if you didn't. His voice was unhurried as his fingers gently caressed her lips. Then let's do it again. As he said that, he really started to bully her again. Linda was so angry that she cried. She twisted her little face and cried. Du Yuesheng, aren't you in your 40s? How could he still have such good stamina? She wasn't in pain, but she was exhausted. Du Yuesheng didn't stop. He lowered his head and kissed her, chuckling. That's because you've starved me for too long. At this moment, she was already intoxicated. She couldn't tell north from south and could only moan softly. After listening to his words, it took her a while to come back to her senses. Gritting her teeth, she glared at him. Your wife, those women outside of yours, can't satisfy you? Du Yuesheng kissed her forcefully and fiercely. After kissing her, he said in a very low voice, You're jealous, huh? Linda opened her misty eyes, looked at him, and provoked him without a care for her life. Old man Du, I think you're dirty. His eyes deepened as he chuckled softly. Is that so? I'll see if you think I'm dirty later. Compared to her, he was a very experienced man. His methods were enough to torture her to the point that she wished she was dead. Du Yuesheng also felt that he was too polite and gentle to her, so he let go and tormented her. Originally, it was only their second time. He wanted to be gentle and give her a good impression. But now there was no need for that. She actually dared to say that he was dirty. 2 hours later, Linda was tortured to the point that she was on her last breath. Lying on her stomach, she said weakly, You're not dirty. She begged for a long time before he let her go. She couldn't care less about cleaning up and fell into a deep sleep. When he woke up again, it was already 6 in the afternoon. When she opened her eyes, she discovered 2 miraculous things. One was that her luggage had been moved back, and the other was that little Long Yu was currently eating in her arms. She did not move for fear of startling the child. She raised her eyes and looked at the seated Du Yuesheng. He was looking at her with a burning gaze. I've never seen you feed a child before. Her tone wasn't very good and was a little hoarse. Thinking of how he had tortured her before, she did not have a good expression on her face. At the same time, she also had a headache. If Annie Zhao was here, he would restrain himself, but now, she could only hope that Aunt Zhao would come back soon. Perhaps sensing her thoughts, Du Yuesheng said indifferently, Auntie Zhao won't be back for the time being. She stared at him through narrowed eyes. Du Yuesheng lowered her head and kissed her face. I was the one who invited Annie Zhao. I spent 1,000,000 yuan. You're shameless. She angrily raised her hand to slap him. What he never expected was that Du Yuesheng did not dodge, and instead took the slap head on. Linda was stunned. However, Du Yuesheng thought nothing of it. I hurt you just now. Now that I've returned the favor, we're even. He shamelessly thought that he could continue tormenting her tonight. Just thinking about it made him happy. The 1,000,000 yuan was well spent. Chapter 1926. Linda hugged the child and ignored him. In her eyes, he was a man who was obsessed with sex and had no integrity. How could he be like this? Pouncing on the bed the moment they met. It wasn't that she didn't feel wronged. He used his power to threaten her with the child. The more she thought about it, the more she hated him. She cursed him, Old Man Du, countless times. It was better if he couldn't get it done. Look at how he was still fooling around with women. She remained silent, not making a sound, and ignored him. Du Yuesheng looked at her little expression. How could he not guess what she was thinking? A woman's struggle was nothing more than whether a man's body was loyal, and whether his feelings were loyal. In terms of feelings, he had indeed given up on her once, so there was nothing much to say. But his body, originally, he wanted to be jealous of her, but seeing her sad and even disgusted look, he couldn't bear to do it. He squatted in front of her, and their eyes were level. His large palm held one of her small hands and gently called out to Shan Shan. Don't call me that. You don't deserve it. Linda's eyes were a little red as she said softly. She told herself that she hated him and would ignore this man in the future. But why did he still appear? Du Yuesheng, feelings aren't something you can have just because you want them, and it's not something you can give up at any time. Do you understand? She bit her lip, and her voice was a little choked. In front of him, she was still a very pure little girl. How could her little schemes be enough to fight with him? Dewey Weshing reached out and stroked her slender hair. He was full of tenderness, as if he was treating a junior. Linda, push him away. This old pervert. When he was torturing her, he didn't have this kind of patience. He was extremely rude. Dewey Weshing smiled, understanding that the little girl was angry at him. Most importantly, she disliked him for being dirty. Shan Shan, he called out to her again. His voice was elegant and magnetic, and even had a hint of love. She still ignored him, but he didn't mind. He still said in a low voice, "Look, you've hit me, scolded me, and vented your anger. Can you let me say a few words?" She wanted to stubbornly say no, but she swallowed the words. Why should she care about him? Dewey Weshing only felt that she was so cute. He rubbed her, and then rubbed little Long Yue's sparse fur. Only then did he say in a low voice, "Indeed, I had many women in the past, but I didn't mess around. They were all bought with money, the kind that wouldn't cause any trouble." Just as he finished speaking, his Shan Shan exploded. "Mr. Dew, you also spent $5 million to settle me. I don't want any trouble either. It's me who wants to trouble you." Dewey Weshing smiled and pressed her forehead against it. Somewhat forcefully, she held her in her arms. "In fact, during the month we were separated, I still had other women. Not many, but I did come into contact with a few." Linda was so angry that she was powerless. "Fine, even if it wasn't me at that time, you still liked Sister Liangxiu, didn't you?" Dewey Weshing didn't avoid it. What kind of person was he? He didn't want to hide it from her. He smiled faintly and said, "But at that time, your sister Liangxiu didn't agree to be with me, right?" She glared at him. He was so sly. Dewey Weshing smiled slightly. "Then let's continue." His voice deepened. "Ever since I knew that you were pregnant with my child, I didn't have any other women." She was stunned. Chapter 1927. He explained to her in a gentle voice. She was shocked and looked at him with her mouth wide open. "Shan Shan, don't despise me. Don't despise an old man in his early 40s who finally fell in love with a girl. Okay?" He pressed his face against the side of her face. "Shan Shan, even if you like my money, it's okay." She asked gloomily, "Give it all to me. I can give you my cash and real estate, except for the shares of the family business, which I can't touch." He actually answered her question very seriously. Linda forced herself to cheer up and asked lazily, "How much property do you have?" "About tens of billions." Dewey Weshing frowned. "You have to ask my financial advisor." Linda lay flat. "Dewey Weshing, were you too stingy in the past? You wanted to buy a child with 100 million? He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. An angry little girl was really difficult to deal with. He couldn't coax her for a long time, so he simply gave up. Anyway, he had already told her that whether she agreed or not, she had to marry him. After Linda finished feeding the child, she adjusted her clothes and laid Longyu down. After looking at the little fellow's little face for a while, she lightly got up. "Dewey Weshing, wait for me in the hall outside. I'll come out after I take a shower." She paused. "Don't go to the bathroom. I don't want to talk to you there." Dewey Weshing showed a look of pity, but he still went outside first. It was a good thing that she was willing to talk. Linda watched him go out, pursed her lips, and walked into the bathroom. 10 minutes later, she came out, put on her clothes, and went to the hall. Surprisingly, Dewey Weshing wasn't sitting in the living room, but was busy in the kitchen. There was a fragrance of food floating in the air. It was very homey, especially when he was wearing a small apron. It was very funny. Linda slowly sat on the sofa, watching him busy, a little absent-minded. He had only said some things before and did not say everything, but she had already guessed it. From the day he got married, he wanted to divorce, so he found those women to anger Lin Shimin. Why did he do this? Her heart was beating wildly. When she came back to her senses, he had already prepared the dishes and came to call her. "What are you thinking about?" His voice was a little gentle. Linda looked up, and her brain asked a shameful question involuntarily. "Aren't you tired?" He did it 5 times in the afternoon. For a man in his early 40s, this was already an incredible thing. Dewey Weshing smiled. "In fact, if you're willing, I can do it 5 more times." He paused for a moment and deliberately teased her. "After all, I haven't had sex for more than a year. I can't help it." Because of a little girl's thoughts, I have to endure it, but I'm still called dirty. Her face was a little hot. After a while, she stood up and said, I'm hungry. Let's eat first. At this time, it was already nightfall. It seemed that he had spent the entire morning and afternoon in bed. Du Yuesheng took great care of her, as if she was his little daughter. After a while, his gaze fell on a certain part of her, his eyes burning. Drink some soup. This way little Longyue will have enough to eat. Her face was a little hot, and she drank the soup without asking. The meal was eaten in silence. Everyone had their own thoughts. Chapter 1928. Linda sat on the sofa and hugged her knees as she looked at him. There was a hint of caution in her eyes. She was really afraid of him, afraid that he would take the child away. However, when she opened her mouth, she said something that went against her heart. Du Yuesheng, I can go with you, but we agreed. He was about to wash the dishes when he heard her words. His body stiffened and his hands stopped moving. He asked softly, Shan Shan, are you sure? Linda pursed her lips and smiled. Do I have a choice? He turned around and looked at her seriously. You have a choice. He came over and squatted in front of her with an apron around his waist. Shan Shan, you can spend 5 million to find a killer to kill me. Then, you can have Longyue and inherit all my assets. You don't have to marry me, and you can have everything. What you're saying now is very hateful. Her voice was emotionless. He smiled and rubbed her hair. Shan Shan, you can't bear to part with me, can you? Shan Shan, you still like me, don't you? Du Yuesheng, I'm doing it for the child. She sighed. It has nothing to do with liking or love. She said calmly, I can't like a man who has given up on me. She smiled softly. Old man Du, what should I do? I can't like you anymore. Du Yuesheng was extremely sad when he heard that. His slender fingers clasped her little head in his arms, and he closed his eyes. If you don't like me, then don't like me. Shan Shan, don't force yourself. I hope you can be happy. She cried in his arms. Du Yuesheng, you're a bastard. I won't be happy if I marry you. Du Yuesheng's heart ached slightly. After a while, he said self-deprecatingly, Why don't you try? 10 years later, 20 years later, Shan Shan, tell me if you're happy or not. She pursed her lips and didn't say anything else. She knew that she had compromised. It wasn't just his threat, but also that he liked Longyue. He could give the child a complete family. She told herself that that was all. There was nothing else. Du Yuesheng took half a year to get a divorce and a day to get Linda. He was extremely fast. After coming to B-City, he already had a wife and a child. Linda was bound to go back to Hong Kong with him. Before leaving, he went to see Liangxiu and Qin Anlin with her. When she saw Qin Anlin, Du Yuesheng felt her heart bleed. We're all old men. Is it necessary to make our faces look so good? Qin Anlin sat in the spacious hall. The sunlight shone on him, making him look extremely handsome. Linda glanced at old man Du beside her and snorted softly, See, this is called strength. Du Yuesheng touched her face. Why don't I go back and have my face disfigured too? I could do whatever I want. Why don't you just make him into a woman? Linda snorted coldly. Childish. Du Yuesheng carried the child with one hand and touched her nose with the other. Who was the childish one here? As soon as she sat down, Liangxiu came down from upstairs. She was talking to Linda and ignored Du Yuesheng. She was probably angry about what happened before. Du Yuesheng could only chat with Qin Anlin. However, that face was an eyesore no matter how she looked at it. Qin Anlin folded the newspaper and said indifferently, Why? Are you going to bring Linda to Hong Kong? Chapter 1929. Qin Anlin smiled faintly. No, I just thought that you wouldn't marry Lin Shimin at that time. Du Yuesheng said helplessly, I have my reasons. You regretted it on the day of your wedding, didn't you? Qin Anlin hit the nail on the head. Nothing can force you. You were just angry at Linda for being immature. But on the day of your wedding, your heart softened and you regretted it again. Qin Anlin recounted old man Du's experience unpleasantly, which made Du Yuesheng's heart turn cold. Liangxiu. He couldn't let Shan Shan hear these words. He had tried so hard to beautify it. If she heard it, would she still be willing to go to Hong Kong with him? Even if she went, she probably wouldn't let him touch her. He sighed. Shan Shan used to have me in her heart, but now, I really can't grasp it. He smiled bitterly. She probably hates me. She felt that he didn't love her enough. This time, he only came back to look for her because of the child. However, she didn't know that the rich families in Hong Kong never lacked women to give birth to children. If he didn't want to, he wouldn't have been able to give birth to the child. Because it was her that night, he had never thought of abandoning the child. She had ignored the extent of his love for her, and he didn't look down on her. Sheen Allen was right. He regretted it on the night of their wedding, but it was useless. At that time, Lin Shimin was already waiting for him in a bathrobe. That night, he pretended to be drunk to avoid it. That night, he lay in bed and schemed against his wife so that he could return to Shan Shan's side, so that she wouldn't cry in the future. Dui Wesheng fell into his memories. After a long time, he chuckled softly. Anlin, I've never had strong feelings for Shan Shan. It's just a faint liking, but I feel that this liking makes me very happy. He continued, I will also work hard to make Shan Shan happy. Qin Anlin turned his head and looked at his wife. Liang Xiu also turned her head to look at him and smiled faintly. No one objected to Du Yuesheng taking Linda away because they all knew that on the day of Du Yuesheng's wedding, Linda had cried for a very long time. She did not say anything after that, but the name of the child proved that she had always been thinking of Du Yuesheng. Now, she was right in front of him. Du Yuesheng liked Linda, so why not give her a chance? Linda, on the other hand, was confused. She was extremely indignant. Du Yuesheng was so hateful, yet she didn't even spare Sister Liangxiu. If he bullies you, come back and tell me, Liangxiu said. Linda was stunned again. This was really different from what she had imagined. She had more or less thought that Sister Liangxiu would object and even give old man Du two tight slaps. There's nothing wrong with liking someone. Yi Liangxiu smiled. Linda, this little fool, really didn't she know that she had always liked Du Yuesheng and had been waiting for him in B City? She didn't have to worry now, because the one who was loved was the happiest. Linda didn't know that she was probably the happiest person in her heart. Linda looked at this and that, then slowly said, Why do I feel like I've been pushed into a pit of fire? I promise it's not a pit of fire. Du Yuesheng. Old man Du smiled. Shan Shan, I've been working out recently, but you haven't been by my side for the past year, so I don't know the effect. Linda glared at him. Can he have some face in someone else's house? Also, his current behavior was like that of a retard. She told herself that she should care for a retard. She pitied him. Chapter 1930. When Liangxiu sent Linda to the airport, she was reluctant to let her go. After all, Linda had been by her side for so long. Rather than calling her a subordinate, she was more like a sister, just like Su Cheng. Linda was also crying at the airport, looking very reluctant. Du Yuesheng kept sighing at the side. Later, he really couldn't take it anymore. He came over and hugged the baby with one hand and her with the other. Seeing that you're crying like a child, it's not like you're not coming back. Linda was still crying, and her nose was red from crying. Du Yuesheng had no choice but to take a tissue and wipe her tears and snot not too gently. To be honest, he really wasn't used to doing such things. Linda cried all the way until they boarded the plane. She said tearfully, If he bullies me, Sister Liangxiu, you have to take me in. I won't. Yi Liangxiu smiled and also wiped Linda's tears. She actually knew in her heart that Linda was just feeling uneasy. She was afraid. Du Yuesheng kept hugging the baby and didn't show any impatience. When it was time, he gently hugged Linda and boarded the private plane. When the plane took off, Yi Liangxiu watched as the gray got higher and higher, farther and farther away, and finally turned into a small dot. She felt a little cold in her heart. Only then did she believe that Linda would really settle down in Hong Kong for a long time. Hong Kong is so close. We can meet at any time. Qin Anlin was wearing a thin coat. He stood beside her and held her shoulder. Let's go back. We still have to have dinner with Tang Yu and Chi Chi tonight. Yi Liangxiu grunted in agreement. She held his arm and walked with him to the parking lot. In the early winter morning, the sun shone on her body. It was a little warm. She rested her face on the coat on his shoulder and smelled the sunshine. It was the smell of happiness. They got into the car. He drove all the way to the Qin family cemetery. Qin Pei, Lady Qin, Aunt Sue, they were resting here forever. Yi Liangxiu and Qin Anlin stood side by side. He looked indifferent, while Liangxiu was smiling. After standing quietly for a while, she suddenly looked up at him and smiled mischievously. Do you think Aunt Sue will be Dad's concubine? Qin Anlin's face darkened, and he looked at his wife speechlessly. Liangxiu, you think too much. She hugged his arm and smiled more sweetly. The winter sun shone on her, and she looked very soft. Qin Anlin lowered his head and patted her head. All right, let's go back. She grunted and rested her head on his shoulder, looking as if she couldn't walk. Qin Anlin had no choice but to carry her to the car. Before getting in the car, he pressed her against the door and kissed her fiercely. He was kissing her, but she kept smiling and blocked his lips. Anlin, your parents will see. Qin Anlin's breathing was heavy. Didn't you say that he was busy looking for a concubine? With that said, he bit her neck twice as a punishment. Yi Liangxiu said coquettishly, Anlin, we will be seen. We still have to eat later. He finally stopped. His fingers gently touched the bruise on her neck, and he smiled faintly. I thought you weren't afraid. His gaze was too gentle, and she kept looking at it. After a moment, she took the initiative to tiptoe and kiss his lips. Under his gaze, she lowered her eyes and played with the button of his coat. She said in a low voice, Anlin. He looked at her with a deep gaze. Chapter 1931. She knew that he had always been worried that his injuries would scare her. It had been almost a year, and they still did it with the lights off, but she wanted to see him and see his passionate look. Are you sure? His voice was a little hoarse, and his eyes were fixed on her. Yi Liangxiu nodded and hugged his waist. I think we could be a normal husband and wife. Qin Anlin's heart palpitated. A moment later, he lowered his head and kissed her lightly. Okay, let's try. Half carrying her, he brought her to the car and drove towards Tang Yu's villa. Today was family day, and the two families had dinner together. Ever since Yi Muyun came to live in the Tang family, they seemed to have decided to spend Saturday together. It just so happened that Yi Muyun came back from America and also participated. When Qin Anlin and Yi Liangxiu arrived, the servants had already prepared a sumptuous lunch. Of course, the adults had their own table, and the little ones had their own table. Qin Anlin looked at the 6 little ones. The oldest one was his, and the youngest one was his. Tang Yu had worked hard for so many years, but he only had one little heart. He wiped the sweat in his heart and thought proudly that he finally had something better than Tang Yu. Yi Muyun sat at the head of the small dining table. On one side were Momo and Mumu, and behind them were the 2 little ones and an Lan Lan. As for the other side, only the little princess, Tang Shui, or Xiaoxin, was sitting. Yi Muyun, who was 11 years old, was so precocious that he didn't look like a child. He calmly took care of Mommy and Mumu while they ate, but he paid more attention to Xin. He cut the heart-shaped steak that girls liked into beautiful pieces and put it away for her. Xiaoxin probably didn't have a good appetite. After eating 2 pieces, she didn't want to eat anymore. In the end, it was Yi Muyun who fed her. Qin Anlin watched quietly, then turned to Yi Liangxiu and said, You know how to take care of people at such a young age. Yi Liangxiu glanced at him and said, He is redeeming himself to a woman for you. Qin Anlin looked at his wife silently and didn't say anything. Tang Yu and Pei Qiqi looked at each other and smiled. Pei Qiqi immediately fell into Tang Yu's arms. Tang Yu, it seems that Liangxiu has completely dominated Anlin. Qin Anlin looked at Yi Liangxiu meaningfully and said in a low voice, Liangxiu, you seem to be able to control me. His voice was hoarse and warm. Yi Liangxiu's face suddenly heated up. She rolled her eyes at him and pursed her lips without saying anything. Qin Anlin began to laugh, laughing extremely happily. He couldn't help but drink a few more cups. Yi Liangxiu originally wanted to remind him that he had to drive back, but she thought that he probably hadn't been so happy for a long time, so she let him be. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, she drove back with him. The children temporarily stayed at Tang Yu's place because Pei Qiqi liked children. Tang Yu didn't want to spend time with the 2 of them. It was because he couldn't have children. When Yuliancio drove back to the villa where they lived, it was already dark. When the car drove through the black carved gate, the lights of the whole villa were turned on. The warm light in Yuliancio's heart also seemed to light up and warm. The car stopped. She turned her head and looked at Sheen Anlin. He was slightly drunk and was leaning against the back of the chair, sleeping lightly. "Anlin, we're here," she said softly, then turned her body slightly and helped him unfasten the seatbelt. Chapter 1932. She nodded and asked him softly, "Are you still feeling unwell?" He shook his head and stroked her long hair. "How can I feel unwell when you're around?" Every day of happiness was wonderful. It was all given to him by God. He loved her more and more every day. He loved the mother of his child so much that he couldn't stop loving her. Yuliancio buried her face in his chest. "Anlin, I think," he covered her lips. "I know what you want to say." He sighed. "It's enough. It's been long enough. If you want to do it, then do it." Liangxiu, let bygones be bygones. She has also been punished. Lying in his arms, she was a little surprised that he knew her so well. He smelled slightly tipsy, and it was a little seductive, mixed with the scent of a mature man. Liangxiu lay in his arms and raised her head to kiss him. She murmured, "Anlin," in the car. He pressed her head and said in a hoarse voice, "Didn't you say to turn on the lights?" She buried herself in his arms and was busy like a little fairy. "Let's do it in the car first, then go home." She really wanted to do it in the car. She wasn't joking. Sheen Anlin was getting impatient, but he still restrained himself and pulled her long hair gently. "Liangxiu, the car will vibrate." "Then let it vibrate." Liangxiu reached out and pulled the collar of his shirt, looking like a little wild cat. "The servants will see it." There was a hint of laughter in Sheen Anlin's voice. His big palm pulled her long hair gently, and he was not so anxious anymore. "Then let them see." Liangxiu sat directly in his arms and nibbled his neck. Her voice was also warm. "Anlin, I want you." He suddenly kissed her lips, and the kiss was intense. After a while, Liangxiu regretted it. She just wanted to do it slowly, but he was unusually intense. "Anlin, the car is shaking." She desperately tried to stop him, her face hot. "Then let it shake." His voice was hoarse. Liangxiu was about to cry. "The servants will see it." "Then let them see." Sheen Anlin chuckled, then sealed her lips and kissed her forcefully until her body went limp. In the end, she bit his shoulder and said angrily, "Sheen Anlin, you're too hateful." He chuckled and finally let her off. He tidied her up slowly and leaned over. "Liangxiu, let's continue in the bedroom, okay?" She sat in his arms, her clothes untied. She cried softly, "Sheen Anlin, you're a beast. Now you know that I'm a beast." He patted her face. "I haven't taught you a lesson in a long time. How dare you flirt with me like this?" She lay on his shoulder and bit his shoulder. She said shameless things, which made him even angrier. He carried her and walked to the main residence. She immediately buried herself in his arms, not daring to look. "It's the holidays." He found it funny and kissed her. "Liangxiu, open your eyes and look." "I don't want to look." She acted like a spoiled little girl, hugging his neck and hugging him so tightly that he felt like his soul was about to leave him. His large palm slapped her hard. "Behave yourself." But not only did she not let go, she hugged him even tighter. That night, she clung to him. The lights were bright and bright. In the end, she lay in his arms, sweating profusely, and raised her head to kiss him. It seems quite exciting. Chapter 1933. Sheen Anlin pressed down on Liangxiu for the entire night. When they woke up the next morning, Liangxiu looked at herself in the mirror, then went back to the room and jumped on Sheen Anlin, pouncing and biting him. "Can you still see my body?" He chuckled softly and reached out to caress her neck. "Didn't you say it was exciting?" He leaned over and said shamelessly in her ear, "There's still time. Do it again." She messed around for a while and didn't dare to move anymore. She lay on his shoulder obediently, biting her lip and looking at him. No, they didn't do anything else. They just leaned against each other, indescribably gentle. Liangxiu, he whispered in her ear. After the surgery, I seem to be a little excited, perhaps because the topic was too intimate. He bit her ear lightly as he said that. Her face was hot too. She played dumb. What? Don't play dumb. Do you want me to tell you with my actions? Huh? His voice was suppressed, but there was a hint of joy in it, because it was too blissful, too perfect. Yi Liangxiu smiled lightly and hugged him, burying her face in his chest. After a while, she said warmly, "Got it." After a while, she said especially obediently, "I can feel it." Qin Anlin's heart instantly fluttered again. She hugged him tightly and frowned. "Anlin, it's a little painful." He stared blankly for a moment, then immediately helped her check and applied medicine. Everything was done carefully, as if she was a fragile treasure. However, when he was tormenting her, he was ruthless. That was why men were contradictory creatures. The more they treated you seriously, the more ruthless they would be when they went crazy. Yi Liangxiu rested for a day. At 5 in the afternoon, she changed into a dress and put on some light makeup. She and Qin Anlin went to pick up the children to attend Keim's birthday party. GM Hotel. Keim's 30th birthday was held quite grandly. After all, his current status was there. Qin Anlin's appearance inevitably caused a commotion, but he didn't interact too much with the senior management of King Entertainment. He was a person who had left the world. Now that he had returned, he did not deliberately enter the world. He was still the king of the Dark Knight, still manipulating the stock market on Wall Street, while King Entertainment had always been managed by Liangxiu. Keim took Yihuan with him. Yihuan was already 5 years old, and it had been 5 years since Su Cheng left. While everyone was celebrating, Keim's eyes felt a little hot. Every time he saw Yihuan, he would be reminded of Su Cheng. He could stare at Yihuan's face for an entire night because it was as if her face had been peeled off from Su Cheng's face. Now that he was in a high position and had a luxurious life, he was still lonely, just an ordinary father. A man would not be happy without the woman he loved by his side. Even if they could see each other a few days a year, it was far from enough. The crystal lights refracted every inch of the scenery. The atmosphere was getting more and more lively, but the loneliness in Keim's heart was getting deeper and deeper. He held a glass of red wine in his hand as he looked at the crowd. A bitter smile appeared on his face as he slowly turned his head to look at the dark night outside. But he saw his little fairy in an orange gown. Su Cheng stood there, wearing light makeup and an expensive gown on her slender body. As she stood there, time seemed to return to the past. She was still that little princess. Keim's eyes felt a little hot, and the surroundings seemed to have quietened down. After a while, he slowly walked over and stopped in front of her. He smiled slightly and said, "Cheng Cheng, can you dance with me?" She placed herself in his hands, and he held her in his arms all of a sudden. Finally, she returned to his side and did not leave. "Thank you, Anlin." Yi Liangxiu gently hugged Qin Anlin and smiled slightly. "We will all be happy in the future, right?" He smiled and lowered his head to kiss her. "I will work hard. In the car, on the sofa, in the bathroom, whatever Mrs. Qin wants, I can do it." Chapter 1934. 9 years later, at the entrance of B City's top university, cars were everywhere. The most eye-catching was a limited edition Bugatti Veyron parked by the roadside. The smooth body of the car exuded a unique sense of respect under the setting sun. The car door was opened, and a youthful girl sat in the front passenger seat. Her school bag was also thrown into the back seat. Tang Sher, little heart, was wearing the B University uniform. The ordinary uniform looked indescribably good on her, especially the cotton socks and the small portion of her tender calves that was exposed between the folds. Her skin was so fair that it was almost transparent. Yi Muyun's beautiful fingers held the steering wheel. He turned his face sideways, and his chiseled facial features revealed his displeasure. "Why are you 5 minutes late?" Although he was just asking casually, her whole body was tense. Yi Muyun was the most lenient. He was even more lenient than her own parents. She pursed her lips and lowered her eyes. After a while, she sneaked a peek at him and realized that he was looking at her attentively, as if he would not give up until he got an answer. She muttered in her heart, domineering. However, although she was dissatisfied, she was still very afraid of him. She did not dare to show it, and answered honestly, "Today is the student council election. I became a student on duty." Sweeping the floor? Yi Muyun sneered. His slender fingers were on the steering wheel, and he had already made the decision for her. Rejected. In his opinion, this kind of thing was a waste of time and life. It was meaningless. However, Tang Sher was silent. She lowered her head and stroked the corner of her clothes with her little hand. He tilted his head and looked at her side profile. The 18-year-old girl had already grown up. Her eyebrows were picturesque, and her small nose was tall and straight. She was lively and bright, and her little mouth was rosy and moist. He remembered that sweet taste. When he spoke again, his voice was tense. "You're not willing?" "Yes." She nodded honestly. After a while, she raised her head and looked at him with a light gaze. "Brother." Her voice was timid, and it carried the fear she had for him since she was young. This word, big brother, made Yi Muyun's heart sink fiercely. He had never been her brother, not in name or by blood. When he was 14 years old, he finished all of his university studies and came to live with the Tang family. She had always been afraid of him, but she still called him Big Brother with a trembling voice. She called him that for 6 years. She couldn't change, but he didn't ask her to. After studying abroad for 3 years, when he came back, he was 17 and she was 15. They were still as green as a fruit. 3 years had passed, and he had made a name for himself in Boise, sitting in the position of vice president. She, on the other hand, was already an 18-year-old girl. They were only 2 years apart, but he was older than her by more than a few years. But he would rather she stay like this forever, weak and slender, in his arms, waiting for her at any time. At this time, he was confused by her calling him Big Brother. After a while, he faintly said, "You like it?" Tang Sher nodded again. "I want to make more friends." "Friend?" He raised an eyebrow. "Don't you like me accompanying you?" As he spoke, his voice was low and slightly raspy. He didn't sound like a 20-year-old boy. Tang Sher secretly cursed Shun Yin in her heart. Here he goes again. In front of him, she would always be weak and afraid. He always decided everything for her. What school she went to, what clothes she wore, and even the friends she made. She didn't live under his wings, but under his shadow. Chapter 1935. She didn't make a sound. Yi Muyun stretched out 2 slender fingers and pinched her chin gently. "You don't like it, huh?" Tang Shui lifted her eyes and looked at his young and handsome face. He was extremely good-looking, but he was too cold and had a maturity that didn't match his age. His current look was what she was most afraid of. It was as if he wanted to eat her up. "I like it." In the end, she still gave in to his long and powerful aura. She lowered her eyes and didn't dare to look at his handsome face. He was undoubtedly an extremely outstanding person. He was only 2 years older than her, but he was already in control of life and death in the business world. And facing such an outstanding person like him, she felt pressured. In his eyes, she was just like a rice worm. They didn't have much in common. Whenever they were alone, she would be afraid. She was afraid that he would kiss her, because when he kissed her, her body would feel as if she had been electrocuted. It was extremely uncomfortable. She couldn't control that feeling. So whenever he looked like he wanted to eat her up, she would pretend to sleep or do her homework. Just like now, he had been on a business trip for a week and had come to pick her up from school the moment he came back. And now he was looking at her like that. She instinctively struggled and wanted to avoid it, but he used a little more strength in his fingers. Her fair chin instantly turned a little green. Her skin was extremely fragile. She couldn't be touched since she was young. A single touch would leave a mark for a few days. He wouldn't use force on her easily, but they hadn't seen each other for a week, and he did miss her. He unbuckled his seatbelt and lowered his head to kiss her. Tang Sher instinctively retreated. Her eyes were filled with helplessness as she looked at him with wide eyes. His lips were imprinted on her lips. It was very soft and had the coolness of a young man. It smelled good. It was numb as if she had been electrocuted. She was so scared that she didn't dare to close her eyes. She opened her eyes and looked at his lowered eyes. He was handsome and had been controlling her for a long time. It seemed like it was natural for them to become a couple. But in her heart, she felt that it was unreal. She always felt that such an outstanding person like him. Why would he bother her? Just when she was distracted, her little face was cupped, and he began to test the depth of his kiss. This was what she was most afraid of. Her eyelashes trembled, her breathing stopped, and her little mouth was tightly pursed. But he had always been strong, so he still succeeded. Taking advantage of the situation, he whispered her nickname, Xiaoxin. His masculine scent invaded her body. She was so scared that she grabbed his shoulder. Her fair and slender fingers gripped his shirt tightly, leaving a long crease on it. No matter how many times she tried, she was still afraid and not used to it. However, he suddenly kissed her, venting all the longing he had for the past week in this kiss. Her slender body was like a reed in the wind. She could only cling to him and let him do whatever he wanted. A hopeless struggle, a complete entanglement, at the school gate where people came and went. After a long time, he seemed to be finally satisfied and withdrew from her lips. His unfathomable gaze was still locked onto her, staring at her with a burning gaze. Did you miss me? Chapter 1936. She leaned against the back of the chair, her red lips trembling slightly. There was a touch of moisture on her lips, which was really very seductive. She didn't understand why he liked kissing so much. It was obviously numb and painful. At least she felt that way. Could it be that he was very comfortable? Yi Muyun lifted his body slightly, but he didn't completely return to his original position. He was still hovering above her, his gaze deep, his slender fingers stroking her lips lightly. His voice was a little hoarse. Fasten your seatbelt. Tang Sher was stunned and didn't come back to her senses for a long time. His handsome face was so close, his tall nose was even rubbing against hers. It was slightly cold, but his breath was frighteningly hot. She unconsciously bit her lips and made a sound of agreement. She was obedient and confused. He couldn't help but lean forward and kiss her lips lightly again for a while. This time, she didn't catch him, but clutched the hem of her dress tightly. She was so nervous that her whole body was stiff. In the end, he left and gazed deeply at her lips. Scared, she shook her head randomly and looked at him with her eyes wide open. He smiled as if he was pleased and stroked her long hair. You're still scared. I'm not. Tang Sher clenched her small fists and said softly but stubbornly. He stroked her long hair again, as if she was his little pet. That night, show that you're not scared. That night, she suddenly deflated and looked at him with a bitter face. Did he really have to kiss her? Her eyes were so pitiful. Could he not kiss her? Yi Muyun felt helpless in her heart and softened a little. What a child. He still buckled her seatbelt personally. Let's go home. This home was the Tang family. He had been living here for many years, and he was like a part of this family. She also recognized it, except when he kissed her, except when he looked at her with a devouring gaze. At that time, Tang Sher would happily think that it would be great if he lost his appetite for her one day. How great would it be if he changed to another person to nibble on? Sometimes she would look in the mirror and feel that she was very thin. Other than her skin being a little better, she didn't have much flesh. Fortunately, he only liked to kiss her and had no intention of exploring her. Along the way, he did not speak. He wound down the car window and played some soothing music. At the red light, he didn't chat with her, and she peeked at him. Just looking at him made his heart beat wildly. She was still so afraid of him. What are you looking at? He asked calmly, his long hand reaching for the control in front of him as if he wanted to grab a cigarette. But he only touched it for a moment before putting it down again. Her heart beat faster again. She just looked at him like that. He smokes? He was only 20 years old. But then she remembered that he was already the vice president of a multinational company. It was not strange for him to smoke. Yi Muyun withdrew his hand. He didn't smoke in front of the little girl. He only turned his head to look at her and coldly spat out 3 words, "Coward." She pursed her lips in dissatisfaction, turned her face to the side, and looked out of the car. However, She didn't notice that his gaze had become gentle in an instant. The car entered the traffic again, and about an hour later, they arrived at the Tang family's main residence. Tang Yu and Pei Chi-Chi lived here as well. However, they often traveled abroad, so only Yu Miyun and Tang Sher lived here. Chapter 1937. It was a big deal that young Master Yi and Miss were back together. Young Master had gone on a business trip for a week. Now that he was back, he had to make up for it. Yu Miyun got off the car. She was only wearing a simple white shirt and beige trousers. At 184 centimeters, she was tall and well-built. She was a natural clothes rack, especially with her long legs. When she got off the car, she stole the limelight. The little servant at home covered her face. So handsome. He alighted from the car first, then went to the front passenger seat. He opened the car door and saw that the little one was still not moving. He raised an eyebrow and looked at her. "We're home. Daddy and Mommy aren't home." She looked up and did not answer his question. Yu Miyun's face was slightly cold. "So, I'll torture you well." As he said that, he bent over and unbuckled her seatbelt. He grabbed her little hand and strode towards the main house. Tang Sher followed behind him awkwardly. She bit her lip. "Let go of me. Call me brother." His voice was still cold. "Bad guy," she thought to herself, but still softly called out, "Big brother." The girl's soft voice sounded lovely, and his heart softened a little. He stopped in his tracks and turned around, letting her bump into his arms, her face resting on his shoulder. Her nose hurt, and she let out a yelp. Yu Miyun supported her with one hand and lifted her little face with the other. "Your nose hurts?" Her nose was red, and there was a touch of moisture in her eyes. She looked pitiful. He replied softly, but he quickly pinched her nose hard. She screamed in pain. However, he chuckled softly. His voice was a little joyful, but it also had the unique naughtiness of a young man. She looked up and glared at him. He leaned closer. "Everyone's watching. It'll be embarrassing if you cry." His handsome face was so close to hers, good-looking and annoying at the same time. When she was angry, she forgot everything. She opened her little mouth, revealing a row of sharp teeth, and bit the tip of his nose to vent her anger. His gaze suddenly became deep and clear, and he looked at her with a burning gaze. Our Tang Sher, on the other hand, was filled with regret. Why did she take the initiative to provoke this demon king without any fear of death? Yu Miyun stared at her for about a minute. His gaze looked like he was going to eat her up. Tang Sher didn't dare to make a sound. Her little face blushed, and she lowered her head, not daring to look at him. He held her hand and continued to walk into the living room, lecturing her. "Don't bite people in the future." He said her like she was a dog. She was unhappy, but there was nothing she could do. They sat on the sofa, waiting for dinner. Yu Miyun sat with his long arms and legs, holding a business magazine in his hand. His posture was casual, but he was still insanely good-looking. Tang Sher, on the other hand, was playing her game. With the Demon King around, she kept her voice low, afraid that she would piss him off. She felt bitter in her heart. This was clearly her home, but he seemed more like the owner of the house. Especially when Daddy and Mommy weren't at home. He acted like her guardian, sending her to and from school every day. He even had to go through her homework. She secretly thought that if someone didn't know better, they would think that he was her little daddy. Perhaps because she had relaxed, she felt a little uncomfortable sitting down, so she switched to lying on her side. She felt uncomfortable again, so she switched to lying down with her feet facing him. Chapter 1938. His face suddenly turned red. After all, he was a young man who didn't know how to do things between a man and a woman, yet he was acting like this in front of him. He suddenly remembered that it would be her 18th birthday next month. His long eyelashes lowered, hiding the excitement in his eyes, but he couldn't look away. But the girl who had been seen naked was still clueless. Her legs were swinging back and forth, beautiful and charming, dazzling his eyes. He was no longer in the mood to look at the magazine in his hand. He only wanted to look at her. Annie Lee came over to call for dinner and saw this scene. She was experienced, so how could she not know what a young boy and girl were thinking? She pursed her lips and smiled, feeling happy. Although young Master Yi wasn't a member of the Tang family, everyone in the Tang family knew that young Master Yi was recognized by Mr. Tang and was highly regarded. Otherwise, he wouldn't have stayed for so many years. Moreover, young Master Yi was likely to take over Boy Yi and become Mr. Tang's successor. The matter between young Master Yi and Little Miss was also natural. It seemed that they had been a couple since they were young. Only someone like young Master Yi was worthy of such a petite and cute girl like Little Mississippi. It was just that he was a little cold. But boys were proud. It was common for them to be cold on the outside but warm on the inside. Annie Lee couldn't stop smiling. Young Master, Miss, it's time for dinner. As soon as she opened her mouth, Yi Muyun looked up with a bit of embarrassment in his eyes. He nodded quietly. Okay. After that, he rolled up the magazine and tapped Tang Sher's little foot. Dinner time. She was still acting shamelessly, refusing to get up. Auntie Lee saw this and pursed her lips, leaving first. Yi Muyun watched Annie Lee leave and tapped her little butt again. His voice was a little deeper. Why aren't you getting up? Do you always not eat like this when I'm not at home? This time, she was hit so hard that she jumped up. Then she realized that she was inappropriate, and she also saw the touch of passion in his eyes. Blushing, she pulled the hem of her skirt and said in a small voice, I'm going to wash my hands. He grunted in acknowledgement and stood up. During the meal, her bowl was filled to the brim with nutritious food. She looked up at him and protested, You're feeding pigs. Yi Muyun quickly and elegantly finished his dinner. He was indeed hungry. He looked up and said in a faint voice, Aren't you? Pausing for a moment, he seemed to realize something and chuckled. I've figured it out. You're not a pig, but a rice worm. Her eyes reddened. She hated his high and mighty attitude the most. It was as if she was an idiot. Yes, she was an idiot. She had failed all her exams, and he had donated a library to her so that she could attend school. Moreover, he had taken care of this matter all by himself. Even her biological parents did not know that her results were so bad. As for the parent-teacher conference, he was also the one who attended it. In the whole world, only Yimiyun knew how useless she, Tang Sher, was. She may have a beautiful appearance, but in reality, she was just an idiot. But even so, he was not allowed to say such things to her, because he kissed her. She felt that the price was too high. However, after so many years, it was too late for regrets. She could only watch helplessly as he invaded her life, her everything, and claimed to be her boyfriend. Everyone would think that they would get married in the future. Even she seemed to be slowly accepting it. Even now, she was still angry when he said such things to her. Chapter 1939. Yimiyun put down his bowl and chopsticks. He was no longer in the mood to eat. His little milk bun was obviously angry. He just sat there and looked at her quietly. He looked at her as she stuffed the rice in her mouth and chewed it hard, as if the rice was him and she could vent her anger. But even though she was angry, the 18-year-old girl's eyebrows and eyes were bright and beautiful. Yimiyun was a mature person. As he looked at her, he vaguely remembered that she looked more and more like the young Pei Chi-Chi. However, Pei Chi-Chi was Uncle Tang's wife, and Xiaoxin, who was Cher, was his. His expression became much gentler. He reached out and brushed the hair hanging in front of her forehead and tucked it behind her ear. His voice was also faint. Do you have a grudge against this rice? If you eat it like this, what are you if not a rice worm? Tang Sher's little mouth was full, and she stared at him. She looked extremely cute, but her big eyes were filled with tears and looked pitiful. She slowly finished the food in her mouth and lowered her head. She only dared to say softly, It's none of your business. Yi Muyun sighed in his heart. She was angry again. He rubbed her head with his big palm and rubbed it hard. Her little head was as soft as a small animal. As he rubbed it like this, his heart also started to move. But after all, this was a restaurant. No matter what he wanted to do, he had to restrain himself. The little girl did not want him to rub her head like this, but she did not dare to avoid him. In fact, she could not avoid him even if she wanted to. She endured until the end of the meal. She was angry after all. After eating, she got up with red eyes and ignored him. Yimeyun sat there and looked at her back with his deep eyes. His whole body was tense. When Andy Lee saw this, she knew that the two little ones were quarreling again. She was not worried. They had been like this all these years. They were still children, and quarreling was a common thing. Annie Lee came over to clean up and teased the young master with a smile. Young master, just coaxing them will be fine. Yi Muyun nodded reservedly, got up, and slowly went upstairs. Annie Lee stood on the spot and sighed. She could see that the young master loved the young lady very much, and the young lady also liked the young master. However, because she was afraid since she was young, she had always been suppressed. Yi Muyun went upstairs and went to her bedroom first. She stood on the balcony and smoked a cigarette. His body was a little tired. He should be resting, but that little fellow was still angry at him. How could he sleep peacefully? She put out her cigarette and walked to her bedroom, which was right across from his. The bedroom door was closed, but it was not locked and opened with a twist. The little girl's room was mainly light purple, which was very aesthetically pleasing. Yi Muyun frowned almost imperceptibly. He stepped on the thick white wool carpet and walked straight in. There was no one in the bedroom, and the study room was empty, but her backpack was thrown on an armchair. Yi Muyun walked to the door and looked in the direction of the bathroom. There was a faint sound of running water coming from inside. He walked back and opened her backpack. The more he looked, the worse his expression became. The entrance exam results, all of them failed. Yi Muyun looked at the results and felt that he was only 20 years old, but he already had the heart to raise a daughter. Her IQ was really a waste of Uncle Tang and Annie Pei's genes, but it was not that she was not smart, but she did not take it seriously. Chapter 1940. Yi Muyun let out a long sigh. He wanted to smoke a cigarette, but he held it in. He strolled back to her bedroom. She hadn't come out yet, so he leaned against the headboard and closed his eyes to rest. In his heart, he was also thinking about how to teach her by example. It was already half an hour later when Tang Sher came out. She stayed in the bathroom for a long time because she heard the door open. At this time, the only person who would enter her room was Yi Muyun. She came out barefoot, wearing only a pink bunny pajamas that reached her knees, revealing a small portion of her fair and tender legs. It was sleeveless and looked rather cool. When she saw the person lying on the bed, she wanted to change into thick pajamas. However, she had just moved a step when Yi Muyun's voice came over faintly. "Come here." Tang Shuer was stunned. Her little feet twisted on the carpet for a long time. She didn't want to go over, but she didn't dare to not go over. He was rather patient, lying down and waiting without even opening his eyes. She had always been afraid of him. Rather than saying he was her boyfriend, it would be more accurate to say that he was the head of the prison. After being in a stalemate for a long time, she finally walked over and leaned against the side of the bed. She pursed her lips and called out in a low voice, "Brother." Yi Muyun opened his eyes and looked straight into her helpless eyes. The moment he opened his mouth, his voice was already hoarse. Afraid of me? He knew that she was afraid of him, and he never thought that it was a bad thing. For example, other than special occasions, she was more obedient to him and would listen to him obediently. Tang Sher shook her head. Her long hair had been washed and was draped over her shoulders, reaching her waist. With a gentle flick, a few strands of hair brushed past the tip of his nose. She wanted to take it back, but he didn't let her. Instead, he took the opportunity to grab it and play with it casually in his palm. He said, "Lie over here." She froze for a moment. It was rare that she didn't listen to him. Instead, she instinctively took a step back. He was sleeping on the bed, and she didn't dare to approach him. This was probably a young girl's modesty. The movement of stepping back hurt her hair. Fortunately, he didn't force it and let go of his palm, temporarily letting her go. "You don't have anything to say to me?" His voice was indifferent as he reached out his hand. After all, Tang Sher felt a little guilty, and she needed him to show up tomorrow, so she obediently gave him her hand and sat on the edge of the bed. Just as she sat down, he pulled her over, and her delicate body fell into his embrace, tightly hugging him. Her nose bumped into his mouth. It hurt, but she didn't dare to scream. Experience told her that if she dared to scream, he would kiss her right then and there. She was scared to death, but she still reached out and wrapped her arms around his firm waist. She hugged him obediently and let him stroke her head like a pet. Her hot little face leaned over and pressed against his chest. Her voice sounded like a little kitten. I had an exam a few days ago. Yi Miyun's fingers gently stroked her little head and faintly nodded. She raised her eyes, her gaze brimming with tears. Then, she lowered her eyes and said dejectedly, "Fail." A strange look flashed past Yi Miyun's eyes as he asked her in a serious tone, "Which exam did you fail?" She quickly raised her eyes, but she lowered them even more quickly and said shyly, "All fail." With that said, she waited quietly for him to laugh at her. In any case, she was already used to it. Chapter 1941. But what she saw was his deep expression. His gaze was looking at her as if it was on fire. Moreover, at this moment, she realized that she was lying on her stomach, afraid that he would mess around, so she wrapped her legs around him. In the end, he seemed to be a little excited. Yi Miyun's eyes looked at her deeply. The heat in his eyes made her feel vaguely afraid. She vaguely felt that he wanted to eat her up again, but it wasn't a bite like when they were young. It was something else. But the little girl didn't know what it was. She could only lie in his arms like a little kitten, her little hands hugging his waist tightly, afraid that he would mess around. Yi Miyun let out a long breath and calmed down. He looked down at the little girl in his arms. She was smart to hug him so tightly. She was afraid that he would do something, but if he wanted to do it, she couldn't stop him. Moreover, he knew that Uncle Tang had tacitly approved of their relationship. Even if there was anything, he wouldn't blame him. His plan was to wait for her to turn 20 before they got married. Although it was a little early, since he had set his mind on her, it was just exercising his rights as a husband in advance. Yi Miyun's dark eyes deepened. He reached out and caressed her long hair, caressing it casually. His voice was a little husky for some reason. "You're not afraid, hmm?" He grabbed her little arm with one hand and dragged her over. Their faces were pressed against each other. Snow didn't even dare to breathe too loudly. Instead, her body came into contact with something that made one's hair stand on end. Eye to eye, she quickly lowered her eyes. Her eyes looked down at her nose, and her nose looked down at her heart. That little look made him both angry and amused. Although it was such a romantic moment, his expression was still stern. "Why not? I can teach you." He had just seen the results and hadn't looked at the exam papers. Tangxia replied with an "oh" and didn't move. But when she felt guilty, her little feet would rub against him. This time, she wasn't rubbing against the ground, but his leg. "It seems that you prefer to practice kissing." Yi Miyun raised his hand and dimmed the bedside lamp. Suddenly, the light became dim. Cher stuttered, "No, let's do our homework." Her voice was pitiful, as if she was about to cry. Hugging her in his arms, he ignored her pleas and kissed her on the lips. She wasn't used to it, and he didn't kiss her often either. He only developed this habit this year. Once he kissed her, he would not let her go within half an hour. Actually, she could still accept it if it was just nibbling on his lips. What she was most afraid of was that he would do something strange. Tangxia's eyes widened as she watched him close his eyes, a look of enjoyment on his face. She pursed her lips, not wanting him to go deeper. But then, he chuckled and bit her lips. She let out a soft cry, and he succeeded. Her little hands gripped his shirt tightly, feeling extremely helpless. Because of the entanglement of their lips and teeth, it had long exceeded her acceptable range. She trembled and wanted to push him away, but she didn't dare to. What was even more outrageous was that he was no longer satisfied with just kissing her. His large palms slid up her pajamas and held onto her hands. She cried out and pushed him away violently. She was panting, her eyes rippling with mesmerizing tears as she stared at him. Chapter 1942. Sensing that she was trying to escape, he reached out to grab her arm and drag her back. Her little face bumped into his chest, and it hurt a little. However, she immediately felt that his heart was beating really fast. Also, the two buttons on his shirt were undone and his skin was very hot. She did not know much about the matters between men and women. She only knew that when he did this, he wanted to eat her up. She lay on her stomach and did not dare to move. He said hoarsely, "I won't do anything." Nothing happened yet. He had clearly touched her. This was the first time he had done this to her. Would he do this more often in the future? She thought in horror. However, just as she was thinking about it, he had already grabbed her again. His other hand was still holding her waist so that she could not escape. His face was buried in her neck. With a hoarseness that did not match his age, he said, "I won't do anything more." He was a grown man and had a certain curiosity towards the female body, and he only wanted to have her, so the person who could satisfy his fantasies could only be her. Yi Mu-yoon had never felt that he was being domineering like this. He only felt that his fingers were about to melt, and he could not bear to let go of her. She was half crying and half begging, "Brother, don't." This call of brother pulled him back to his senses, and he finally let her go. He allowed her to get up and retreat far away. He sat up as well and looked at her guarded little eyes. With a smile, he said, "Wait for me in the study." After saying that, he walked towards the bathroom. Tang Shui stuck her tongue out at his back. He had been so impatient just a moment ago, but now he was all serious again. Pretentious. She snorted softly, and her little face was red. She pulled up her pajamas and ran to the study barefooted. Although she was stupid, she was still a little smart. She could tell at a glance that the bag had been touched. She carefully looked down and clenched her fists. Her expression was angry. This was too much. He clearly knew that she had failed, but he still tricked her into kissing him. Thinking of the situation just now, her body trembled a little. Her fingers also gently held the place he held just now. Only then did she remember that she did not wear any underwear. In the past, she did not pay attention in front of him, but in the future, she did not dare to be careless anymore. Tang Shui was blushing when Yi Mu-yoon came out of the shower. His hair was almost dry, and he only had a bathrobe hanging loosely on his body. Even so, he was still bewitchingly handsome. She obediently sat behind her little pink desk and sat upright, just like a primary school student. Yi Mu-yoon glanced at her indifferently, walked in front of her, and casually sat sideways on the table. She didn't dare to move around for fear that she would see something she shouldn't. "Where are the papers?" He looked at her. Snow handed it to him, her expression careful. When he took it, he glanced at her again. However, he quickly lowered his head and said while looking at the papers, "I can understand the math and physics, but English." He did not finish his sentence because he saw her saliva stains on the paper. He stared at it for about a minute before he looked up at her. "You fell asleep during the exam?" Tang Shui and Xiaoxin were sitting together. Her little hands were clasped together, and her eyes drifted to the side. She lowered her head and replied honestly, "I was sleepy during the exam." "Then what did you do at night?" His voice was slightly strict. He was really disappointed that she did not meet his expectations. Chapter 1943. Those words were like a sharp weapon. Coupled with her innocent eyes, Yi Mu-yoon could not help but want to hug her in his arms and kill her. However, he was always a restrained person. He just looked at her indifferently, and his voice was even colder. "Is that so?" She obediently agreed, then carefully got up and walked in front of him. She hugged his arm and softly called out, "Big brother." Yi Mu-yoon, on the other hand, didn't fall for her trick. She looked at her condescendingly. "What are you all thinking?" Cher widened her eyes and bit her lips. She thought for a long time, but could not think of anything. "Do I need to think about this?" He stretched out a finger lazily and knocked on her head. There was a hint of reprimand in his voice. Stupid. It was not that he did not feel a sense of loss. He liked her. He had her now and her future. As long as he wanted, she could become his real woman at any time. However, there was always some dissatisfaction in the depths of his heart. They were 2 years apart, and he had loved her for so many years. But she did not know how to love. His mind was filled with thoughts, but his face was still cold as he looked at her disappointing and coquettish little face. Shui hugged his arm shamelessly, rubbing her head against his arm like a little kitten. He could not do anything about it. His heart was a little agitated, but he scolded her, "Sit down." She sat down obediently. The young man, who had just returned from a business trip and was still jet-lagged, helped her to answer the questions one by one. In the beginning, she was quite serious. But within half an hour, her little head was nodding. He knocked her from time to time, but it was useless. The unmotivated little girl sprawled on the study table and fell asleep after an hour. There were 2 lines of saliva hanging on the side of her red lips. Yimyun glared at her with disdain in his eyes. However, his fingers reached out slowly and wiped away her saliva gently. He scolded softly, "Idiot." He was no longer angry. He had been like this for the past few years. How could he still be angry? Punishing her and accompanying her to study were the best ways he could think of to accompany her. But she did not understand. Stretching out his hand, Zhang Xian brushed aside the hair on the little fool's forehead, revealing a beautiful face. He thought to himself that although she was stupid, her appearance was blessed by the heavens. She had shed the baby fat she had when she was young, and now she had grown into a slender and elegant woman. Her skin was like a peeled egg. His slender fingers gently rubbed it twice. His gaze was a little deep and serene for a long time. Then he bent down and picked her up, walking straight to her bedroom. Probably because he had disturbed the little girl's sweet dream, her crystal-clear eyelids opened for a moment and then closed again. Her 2 little claws rested on his neck, and she buried her little face in his neck again. She rubbed against him and finally slept even more soundly. Yimyun lowered his head and called her an idiot again. Only then did he hug her and laid down on the soft bed. This bedroom was filled with the fragrance of a young girl. He could smell it just by lying down. However, none of this could compare to the scent of the milk buns in his arms. He lowered his head and inhaled the fragrance from her neck. He laughed softly and pinched her nose again. "Idiot." Chapter 1944. His bathrobe had loosened a little from her rubbing against it, but he didn't care. He let her sleep and let her grab his fingers. This was the first time his little one had done this to him. That tender little finger was like a little enoki mushroom wrapped around him. It was soft and fragrant, and his heart was filled with endless satisfaction. He turned his head to the side and pressed his forehead against hers, closing his eyes. His body was tired, but he couldn't bear to fall asleep. He opened his eyes and looked at his little buns. Then he broke free from her little hand and raised his hand to turn off the lights in the bedroom. In the darkness, the young girl's fragrance was magnified, and the soft little body in his arms made him feel uneasy. He knew what it was, but she was really too young. He didn't want to take away her first time before she turned 20. His fingers found her lips in the darkness and touched them lightly. His dark eyes suddenly opened, and he stared at her with a burning gaze. The little girl's body trembled, and her long and thick eyelashes trembled slightly. Yes, she was awake, but she was pretending to be asleep. Even with her eyes closed, she could still feel that he was looking at her with that murderous gaze again. After a long time, she still couldn't hold back her fear. She instinctively bit her lips, but accidentally bit his finger. She closed her eyes tightly and didn't dare to open them. "Do you think you'll be fine just like that?" His voice was especially cold in the dark, as if he could shake ice beads out. Tang Sher sighed in her heart. How could people be so different from each other? She didn't make a sound and just hugged his waist like a rascal. His body froze, and then she felt that horrible sensation again, but he didn't do anything to her. Instead, he stroked her long hair and said in a rough voice, "Go to sleep." She heaved a sigh of relief and obediently nestled in his arms. Actually, she wasn't used to sleeping with him, and they didn't sleep together every day. But on the first day he came back from a business trip, he insisted that she sleep with him. She attributed this to the fact that he probably hadn't smelled the buns for a long time outside. So, Tang Sher secretly thought to herself, actually, he hasn't weaned off milk yet. With this thought in mind, she lay on her stomach in a pleasant mood and fell asleep soundly. The first ray of sunshine in the morning shone into the beautiful bedroom, and she moved uncomfortably. Her waist tightened, and she opened her eyes to look at the handsome face in front of her. He was already awake, but did not open his eyes. He only lightly asked, Xiaoxin, what time is it? He rarely called her that anymore. Cher grabbed the alarm clock. 7 o'clock. His eyes were still closed. What time is your first class? Tang Cher tilted her head and thought for a moment. 9 o'clock. As soon as she said that, she was kissed on her little mouth. Her lips felt warm and she was in a daze. His voice was slightly hoarse. Sleep until 8. Then, she was completely in his arms, and he held her as if she was a doll. Little Cher's face was pressed against his chest. His bathrobe had already come undone. She could feel that he was very hot. Not daring to move, he could only lie down obediently. He seemed to be very tired and fell asleep again. The little girl lay in his arms, bound by his long arms and legs, and suffered for a full hour. When he woke up at 8 o'clock, her feet were numb. She wanted to complain, but she didn't dare to. Chapter 1945. She had always been afraid of him. He was a man of his word. So, 10 minutes later, she was already downstairs in the dining room. Yi Muyun sat in the dining room. His long life as a trapeze artist had made him used to eating quickly. In front of him were 3 simple meals and a glass of milk. In front of her were donuts, corn soup, mashed potatoes, and a pure strawberry milkshake. He glanced at her. He had never approved of her breakfast, but he didn't say anything since she liked it. Come here. His voice was calm and dignified. It was probably because he was used to being a leader in Boi. Tang Shui was sat beside him and ate her breakfast in small bites. Her eating speed was like a kitten's. After Yi Miyun finished eating, he contacted his secretary in the 10 minutes he waited for her. He took care of the basic matters and told her that he wouldn't be going to the company in the morning. His secretary also knew the reason. Putting down his phone, he looked at the little girl who was still fighting. His slender fingers landed on the table and gently tapped twice. This meant that she didn't have much time left. The little yellow bun looked longingly at the last donut and swallowed hard. Then she raised her head and looked at him eagerly. Yi Muyun sighed inwardly. She really worked hard. He had never seen her so dedicated to anything else. He picked up the donut and gently stuffed it into her little mouth. He said calmly, "Let's go." Naturally, he held her little hand and walked to the sports car parked on the lawn outside. The little girl's soft and tender little hand struggled for a bit before she safely rested in his palm. Moreover, she was leaning back, so he was basically dragging her along. However, Yi Miyun didn't get impatient and pulled her along in a good mood. Before getting into the car, Tang Cher finally finished the donut and secretly wiped her little mouth. Yi Miyun opened the car door expressionlessly. She stuck out her tongue and got into the car. He closed the car door and went around to get in. He buckled his seatbelt and turned his face. "Have you thought about what to say?" She let out an ah and stared at him blankly. Her rosy little lips were slightly opened. That look, no matter how you looked at it, was cute and hateful. Yi Miyun narrowed his eyes and said slowly, "Wipe your mouth." She was stunned again. He reached out and patted her little head lightly. "You're so stupid." His tone was filled with disdain, but his voice was already hoarse. The little girl obediently picked up a tissue and wiped her mouth. He reached out and pinched her again. His voice was even colder. "So stupid." Cher pouted and turned her face to the side, ignoring him. He was angry. She was angry, but the handsome young man seemed so happy. An imperceptible smile appeared on his lips as he started the car. He was focused on driving and didn't talk to her. The angry little girl couldn't maintain her composure for long. She secretly turned her head to look at him. His side profile was well defined. Because he was young, his face was smooth and pleasing to the eye. After she saw it, she became even angrier. How could such a fierce person be so good-looking? Although she was angry, the car was driving so smoothly that she wanted to sleep. Chapter 1946. The car window was rolled down a little, and the spring breeze caressed her face. The warm sun shone on her face, making her forehead look even brighter. His facial features were so exquisite that they couldn't be any more exquisite. In his heart, he often thought, how could someone so smart be so stupid? But what could he do? No matter how stupid she was, she liked him. There was nothing to dislike about it. He looked at her sleeping face for a long time, and finally leaned over and kissed her forehead lightly. She frowned slightly. When she woke up, she felt a sharp pain on her cheek. "It's fine if you're stupid, but you're so lazy." In front of her was a handsome face with a cold expression. His voice was also cold. His hand was still pinching her cheek. "It hurts, it hurts, it hurts." Little Cher cried miserably, not daring to pull his hand away. He would occasionally teach her a lesson, and if she resisted, she would end up worse. The indifferent young man finally let go of his hand and wiped his hand with a napkin. His voice was elegant and pleasant. "We'll go straight to class later. I'll talk to the class counselor." Because of the pain from his pinching, there were tears in her eyes, which made her look extremely lovable. But he didn't relent. His gaze was indifferent, as if he was waiting for something. Tang Cher knew that she couldn't endure it. She suppressed her dissatisfaction and called out softly, "Brother." But in her heart, she was thinking, "Brother is bad, brother is bad." How could Immerse not know what she was thinking? He snorted softly. "Thank you, brother," the little girl said reluctantly again, but he still didn't open the car door. She was extremely annoyed, but she still looked obedient on the surface. She unbuckled the seatbelt and climbed onto his shoulder. She lowered her eyes, put her little face in his arms, and raised it slightly. She looked very obedient, just like the countless times when she had made a mistake. She would voluntarily put herself in front of him and let him kiss her. Actually, it was the same when he kissed her for the first time. She was terrified, and he helped her clean up the mess with a straight face. After that, he pressed her down and kissed her. Those hot lips and tongues intertwined, making her tremble uncontrollably. Although she was stupid, she was smart in this aspect. If she made him unhappy, she would let him kiss her little mouth and let him do whatever he wanted. Only the heavens knew that what he wanted was far more than this. What he wanted was more terrifying than she could imagine. His gaze was deep as he looked at her raised face. Her eyelashes were trembling slightly. It was obvious that she was afraid. He lowered his head and bit her lips lightly. His voice was slightly hoarse. "Get off, idiot." "That's it." Flustered, she opened her eyes, and their eyes met. He did not shift his gaze away. His black eyes, which were originally filled with anger, were tinged with a faint smile. Her face, however, turned red. "Great Demon King, why do you look so good?" He unlocked the car. She opened the door and got out, running fast with her bag. Immerse didn't get out of the car immediately. Instead, he opened the window. The car window rolled down, and he took out a cigarette from the central control. He lit it up and took a long drag. "I've endured for a long time with a cigarette in one hand and a cell phone in the other." He made a call. However, his gaze was fixed on the little girl's back until she disappeared from his sight. Little did he know that in other people's eyes, he was also a scenery. The expensive sports car was already eye-catching, not to mention the noble and handsome man sitting in the car. Chapter 1947. Immerse quietly finished his cigarette and got out of the car with his phone. He was young after all. Unless it was a necessary occasion, he would not dress too formally. He wore a pair of dark gray trousers with a beige sweater. It was simple but insanely good-looking. When he got out of the car, his pair of long legs were especially eye-catching. The passing girls almost screamed. Immerse walked straight to the office building and settled the matter with the young girl. Of course, he paid a price to get her from failing all her exams to straight A's. Since the class tutor was handling the matter urgently, Tang Cher wasn't surprised when the scores were announced. She had been doing this since the first year of high school. The most exaggerated time was when she fell asleep during an exam and got a 0. Although he helped her, her little mouth was almost swollen from his nibbling. She never knew that someone could kiss so fiercely. Would he be happy like this? After the class tutor announced the scores, his gaze landed on Tang Cher, with a meaningful look. She was not to be trifled with. She naturally knew about that young Mr. Chin. He was President Chin of Boy College. If everything went well, he would be the future successor of Boy College. But was he sure that he doted on his girlfriend like this? Wasn't he hurting her to death? Looking at Tang Cher's face, the class guide had mixed feelings. With a face like this, there was nothing good about her. It seemed reasonable. As long as she was good-looking, she didn't need talent. With her family background, she didn't need to rely on her face, not to mention her talent. Cher had long been trained to be thick-skinned. She gladly accepted such grades. Actually, the class guide was the one who was freaking out. Getting an average grade was good enough. This young President Sheen was very domineering. He had to make his girlfriend happy and get first place in the whole grade. This good-for-nothing campus belle's image of being the first elite would collapse one day. What should he do then? Who would clean it up? This time, it was to donate to the library. What would she donate next time? After the morning class, Zheng Sini, who was sitting next to her, looked at her cautiously and smiled. Shwe, you did well on the exam this time. First place in the whole grade. You're amazing. Cher was puzzled. First in the whole grade? The last place was still the first place. There wasn't much difference, even if it became the first place. He smiled. It's all right. After that, Cher tilted her head. Oh yeah, how did you do? Zheng Sini came from City H. She was a straight-A student in City H. She wasn't too pretty and was slightly plump. She was different from Cher's exquisite figure, but she was good at studying. Cher asked with a subtle expression on her face. But how could a young girl who was born insensitive notice it? It's okay, Zheng Sini said softly, clutching her report card tightly. Total score, second in the whole school. If it weren't for Tang Cher, this stupid horse, she would be the first in the whole school. Zheng Sini had seen Tang Cher score before. It was supposed to be full river red, but now she felt humiliated. It was humiliating to be ranked behind a student with such poor grades. But she couldn't say it out loud. She didn't want to tell others that she was the second in the whole school. It was just that this time, the results were on the list. The whole school would know very soon. The freshman of B University, Tang Cher. Not only was she beautiful, she was also a straight-A student, the first in the whole school. Chapter 1948. However, Tang Cher's looks were not low-key. She was miserable beyond words. Actually, she knew Imuyun's sinister intentions. He wanted to help her rise to the top, so she had to work hard. But she felt that she was innocent, and he would always find a way. Yes, in her mind, no matter what happened, he would always find a way to solve it. So, she continued to do whatever she wanted, eat, sleep, and sleep with a clear conscience. This kind of life was wonderful, except for the fact that the devil didn't travel much lately. He seemed to be very free. At B University, it was drizzling like silk. Zheng Sini stood in front of the rankings, her face drenched in rain. She looked at her name, which was in second place. There was a difference of 5,000 yuan between first and second place, and this 5,000 yuan was her parents' monthly salary. She cared about first place, not only for her pride, but more importantly, the 5,000 yuan. She stood there in a daze, her eyes moving to the senior ranking list, looking at the top of the third-year list. A familiar name, Zhou Chengwang. The ordinary face, the ordinary eyes, began to shine with an extraordinary light. She once told herself that one day she would definitely be on the same level as this person and stand at the same height as him. But she still lost to a good-for-nothing beauty. The rain was getting heavier, but Zheng Sini still stood there motionless. From afar, many students were secretly poking at her. Poor Sini, the class director told her that it was a first-class scholarship, but now it suddenly dropped to a second-class scholarship. She can't take it. Yeah, Sini's family isn't very well off. We all know that, yes. But she has a background. What can she do? Shwe stood not too far away, her face a little tense. She had heard everything they said. She didn't know when, but the people who were talking saw her, and they all fell silent. No one dared to offend her. Cher didn't say anything and walked straight to the school gate. She must be angry. What should we do? Will she use her connections to expel us? Sini, aren't you close with Tang Shwe? Please put in a good word for us. We offended her because of you. Zheng Sini turned around slowly. Her face was covered in water as she watched the girl leave. Her back view was also so moving, they were in a completely different world. She looked at him for a long time before saying softly, "Don't worry, she's not that kind of person. The girls were relieved and started gossiping. I heard she's Boyi's daughter. I wonder if it's true. It's absolutely true. Otherwise, do you think she has the ability to be number one in the school? I don't think so. I heard that everything at the school was arranged by her brother. President Boyi only has one daughter. How could he have a son? Someone said weakly. Thus, someone began to speculate maliciously. Then, her background is not clean. Zheng Sini took a deep breath. Stop guessing. It's a fact that she's number one. Everyone fell silent and looked at her with sympathy. After the scene quieted down, a tall and thin figure appeared. He stood in front of the list and looked at it for a while. A faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. First place. Chapter 1949. Cher walked out of the school and saw Yi Muyun's dazzling Bugatti Veyron. He was a low-key person. Why did he drive such a flashy car? She had asked him once. He looked at her for a long time before replying slowly. Because I look younger. She giggled for a long time. Younger? He was only 2 years older than her. He was only 20 now, but he already sounded like an old man. But later, she found out that he usually took a chauffeur when he went out to work. She walked over, and Yi Muyun got out of the car. She noticed that he was wearing an expensive handmade suit. He must have changed into it at the company and came straight from some formal event. He did not take an umbrella when he got out of the car. The rain splashed on his expensive clothes, but he did not care at all. He opened the door and took the umbrella from her. After she got in, he closed the door and got in. He cleaned himself up with a towel and buckled his seatbelt. He looked at her, not in a good mood. She rarely felt this way. Most of the time, she was happy without a care in the world. There were many times when he asked himself why he liked her. Thinking about it, it was probably because she liked to eat and laugh. He would be happy when he saw someone happy. As for the other good points, it might be because she looked good, really good, the kind of beauty that he wanted to have at first glance. When he asked that, she lowered her head and fiddled with her little fingers. She said in a muffled voice, "No, it's not bad." Not bad. Her little mouth was almost hanging down. But since she did not want to talk about it, he did not ask further and focused on driving. After passing 2 red lights, the car came to a slow stop at the third. Perhaps to cheer her up, he looked ahead with one hand on the steering wheel and the other rubbing his chin. He asked calmly, "Eating out tonight?" If it was in the past, she would have been happy. But now, she could not muster up the slightest bit of interest. Forget it, let's go home and eat. If good food could not pique her interest, it meant that she was really in a bad mood. Yi Muyun did not say anything more and drove back to the villa. Sure enough, she was not in a good mood after she went back. Annie Lee could also see that. Her gaze fell on Yi Muyun's face, thinking that the 2 little ones were fighting again. Yi Muyun's young and handsome face only smiled faintly. He reached out and rubbed the little girl's long hair. Auntie Lee was relieved. This was probably something else. It didn't matter. With young Master Muyun around, even if the little miss wanted the stars in the sky, he could pluck them down. Auntie Lee couldn't help but smile. Young Master Muyun was really good-looking. His faint smile made her heart flutter. However, none of this entered the little girl's eyes. Right now, her heart was filled with those words. Was 5,000 yuan that important to Zheng Sini? She looked sad. She secretly looked at Yi Muyun and suddenly picked up some food with her chopsticks. She smiled sweetly and said, "Big brother, eat." Auntie Lee smiled from ear to ear. The 2 little ones were really loving. It was better for an old woman like her to avoid them. Yi Muyun looked at the food in front of him, then looked at the sweet, smiling little girl and Auntie Lee who had left. He felt a headache. Although he knew it in his heart, he did not show it on his face. "Why are you suddenly so attentive?" Cher looked at him innocently. "Because you're working hard." Chapter 1950. After a long time, he finally ate it. The little girl heaved a sigh of relief. His voice rang out faintly. "One who is unaccountably solicitous is hiding evil intentions." She glared at him, but it only lasted for a few seconds before she quickly looked down. His dominance was deeply rooted in her. Yi Muyun put down the bowl and chopsticks in his hands and stood up. I'll go to the study first. I'll bring my bag over to do my homework later. Homework again? The devil. She stuck out her tongue at his back and resisted a little. Why do I have to do homework every day when I'm in university? Yi Muyun was already slowly walking up the stairs. His figure was tall and straight, and he looked very good from behind. He didn't look back. As he walked, he said faintly, "Let's talk about it when you can pass without doing homework." She was a little embarrassed and clenched her fists. "I definitely will." At that moment, he stood in the middle of the stairs and looked back lazily. His dark eyes were slightly complicated as he looked at her. Cher's heart skipped a beat, and her little face turned slightly red. She thought of a sentence she had read on the internet. "If you were uglier, we could talk about life and ideals. But you're so good looking, I just want to sleep with you." She didn't want to sleep with him. He was so scary. Under his burning gaze, she lowered her eyes and said in a low voice, "I just want to test your ability." Ability? His beautiful lips curled up into a charming arc, and his gaze deepened. "You'll know in the future." Cher bit her lip. She didn't know why, but her face was burning and her body was abnormally hot. She felt that he seemed to have said something important, but she didn't quite understand it. Yi Muyun's gaze became indifferent. "Come over in a while." She obediently replied with an "oh," and watched him leave in a dignified manner. At night, she was especially obedient and worked very hard to finish her homework. She didn't eat snacks or secretly doze off. Yi Muyun knew that she had something on her mind and that she was plotting something. However, he didn't say anything and left the study without giving her a chance to say anything. Sleep early. When he said those 3 words, it meant that he had no intention of sleeping with her tonight. Actually, even if they slept in the same bed, he would at most kiss her. He wouldn't do anything too overboard. Slowly, she realized that he didn't mean it that way, so she wasn't so afraid anymore. The little girl immediately stood up and looked at him fervently. She stammered, "Big brother." He turned around and returned in the same formal suit, but his coat was off and his tie had long since been taken off, but he still looked aloof and handsome. He tilted his head to look at her, his voice as calm as the night sky. "What's wrong?" She sat there, her black hair draped over her shoulders. Her eyes were drowsy, and she carried the innocence of a young girl. "It's still early." He stretched his body and continued to maintain his composure. "I'm a little tired after a 6-hour meeting during the day." "What's wrong?" The little girl pursed her beautiful little mouth. How could she say something as embarrassing as inviting him to her room? She simply lowered her head and said, "Good night." He nodded and smiled. "Good night, Schwer." He spoke very slowly, and his voice was pleasant to the ears. In the middle of the night, there was actually a hint of seduction in his voice. "Good night," just like that. Her little mouth moved, but she didn't say anything. She could only watch him leave. Yi Muyun walked to the door, and a faint smile appeared at the corner of his lips. He knew her very well. She wouldn't sleep until she achieved her goal. You're tuning into the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.